When we picture the first Christians, we usually envision a unified community gathered around a shared meal: bread, fish, and roasted lamb. This imagery is consistent with the traditional accounts of the early church. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Peter receives a vision declaring all animals clean to eat, establishing the dietary standard that remains the norm for billions today. But in the same decades those accounts were written, some of Jesus' closest followers, people from his own culture and family, held a conviction that was the polar opposite. For them, eating meat was a sin. These were members of the original Jerusalem church, the community led by James, the brother of Jesus. They were known as the Ebionites, or the poor ones. They were Jewish followers of Christ who strictly observed the Torah, keeping the Sabbath and the law, but they did so with a specific radical interpretation regarding animals. This raises a question about the origins of the faith. How did a group with direct familial ties to Jesus become so isolated that their version of Christianity was eventually scrubbed from the record? To the Ebionites, Jesus was not God in the flesh, but a human prophet chosen by God to restore the true meaning of the law. Central to that restoration was the end of the temple sacrifice system. The Ebionites believed the daily slaughter of animals at the altar was a corruption of God's original intent for humanity. Their logic was straightforward. If the Messiah arrived to abolish bloody rituals of the temple, violence against animals had to cease entirely. Because eating meat required bloodshed, consuming flesh was direct participation in the violence Jesus came to end. They pointed back to Genesis 1:29, arguing that God's original diet for humanity in Eden was strictly vegetarian. For the Ebionites, meat eating was a consequence of a fallen world, not a divine blessing. Vegetarianism wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a theological requirement. It was the only way to inhabit the peaceable kingdom the Messiah had come to restore. These convictions were codified in their own scripture, the Gospel of the Ebionites. While the text itself is lost, specific passages survive through the writings of early church fathers who quoted the book while trying to debunk it. In one fragment, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I have come to abolish the sacrifices, and if you do not cease from sacrificing, the wrath of God will not cease from you." This commitment to a meat-free narrative was so total that they even re-examined the life of John the Baptist. Most Gospels say John ate locusts and wild honey, but the Ebionites noted that the Greek word for locust, akris, is nearly identical to inkris, the word for a honey cake. In their Gospel, John ate cakes, not insects. They were willing to retranslate and re-record the foundational stories of the movement to ensure that no righteous figure was depicted consuming an animal. The primary ideological opponent to this movement was the Apostle Paul, who championed a version of the faith focused on the Roman, non-Jewish world. Paul taught that salvation came through faith, not through the observance of Jewish dietary laws. He explicitly told his followers they could eat meat, even if it had been sacrificed to pagan idols, an idea the Ebionites found unthinkable. This version of Christianity, one that didn't require circumcision or strict food restrictions, was significantly easier to spread among the diverse populations of the Roman Empire. While the Ebionites remained a small community centered in Jerusalem, Paul's mission went viral. Within a few generations, his Gentile-focused theology became the numerical and political center of the faith. As the Pauline Church grew into the official Orthodox institution of the Roman Empire, the Jewish Christian groups were pushed to the periphery. They were eventually branded as heretics, and their gospels were suppressed or destroyed. The existence of the Ebionites reminds us that the early church was not a monolith, but a landscape of competing visions, leaving the traditions we recognize today as the surviving remnants of a much broader historical struggle.